The House will now have under consideration Senate Concurrent Resolution number 119. The clerk may read.
In the Senate, Senate Concurrent Resolution 119 by State Affairs Committee, a concurrent resolution stating findings of the legislature in designating November 7th in 2020 and in each succeeding year as Victims of Communism Memorial Day. Be it resolved by the legislature of the state of Idaho, whereas the year 2017 marked 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, resulting in the world's first communist regime under Vladimir Lenin, which led to decades of oppression and violence under communist regimes throughout the world, and whereas based on the philosophy of Karl Marx, communism has proven incompatible with the ideals of liberty, prosperity, and dignity of life, and has given rise to such infamous totalitarian dictators as Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Ho Chi Minh, Pol Pot, Nicolae Ceausescu, and the Castro brothers, and the Kim dynasty. Whereas President Donald Trump declared November 7, 2017 a national day for the victims of communism, condemning communism as a political philosophy incompatible with liberty, prosperity, and the dignity of human life. And whereas the bipartisan U.S. Congressional Caucus for the Victims of Communism stated publicly in 2018 that Marxist defenders often say he cannot be held accountable for what communist regimes did long after his life and death, but Marxist dictators who massacred their own people were applying communist ideology to political practice. And whereas communist regimes worldwide have killed more than 100 people and subjected countless others to the worst and widest spread human rights abuses known to history, with victims representing many different ethnicities, creeds, and backgrounds, and whereas through false promises of equality and liberation, communist regimes have, as a matter of government policy, robbed their own citizens of the rights of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of association through coercion, brutality, and fear. And whereas many victims of communism were persecuted as political prisoners for speaking out against these regimes, and others were killed in genocidal state-sponsored purges, and whereas in addition to violating basic human rights, communist regimes have suppressed freedom of conscience, cultural life, and self-determination movements in more than 40 nations, and whereas the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington, D.C. is a nonprofit organization authorized by unanimous act of the United States Congress that educates people about the ideology, history, and legacy of communism and honors the people who have suffered and died under communist regimes. Now therefore be it resolved by the members of the second regular session of the 65th Idaho Legislature, the Senate and the House concurring therein, that November 7th in 2020 and in each succeeding year be designated as Victims of Communism Memorial Day. Be it further resolved that the Secretary of State transmit a copy of this resolution to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation so that members of the organization may be apprised of the state's action on this matter, and further cause the resolution to be posted on the legislature's website.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Gentleman from 1 to open the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Madam Clerk, for that good reading there. And ladies and gentlemen, oftentimes these resolutions are tedious and a bit banal, but this one has flesh to its bones. And if we recall the political situation not so many years ago that most of us lived through, and the international situation, we've come to realize that the veracity in what's being said in this resolution, and also in the handout that you have there, the number of people that have been killed, this is probably a low estimate. Under the regimes of communist dictators and in communist countries, and thus the necessity of this. And because young people are not familiar with it. We've fought communism for many, many years, and it has somewhat been beaten back, although there's a resurgence that we can look at as well. But many young people are now preferring communism and socialist forms of government to a Republican form of government. And that's a problem. So in establishing this resolution, it will be an annual reminder of the horrors of communism and of the people that have to live underneath it, and hopefully change some minds. There will be an opportunity to discuss it and point to the past of how these regimes handle the past, the present, and the future. It's destructive, and it leaves a wake of death in the back and behind them. There are 5 states that have passed similar resolutions to this point, and this is a strong statement for our form of government and against an evil form of government that has revealed itself to be that way. So I would appreciate your aye vote on this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Is there further debate? Gentleman from 3.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to rise to support this resolution. I'll have to give you a little bit of my background. My parents are both from Poland. They're on to their Heavenly Father now, but My father served in the Polish Army from before the time World War II started, so he was in the Army, as were most young men in most European countries, serving their country before the war started. So he served for 6 years trying to defend his native country of Poland from the Nazis. And if you remember history, it was the Nazis that invaded Poland from the west, and the Russians, the Soviets, excuse me, the Russians are honorable people, that invaded from the east, and it was the two largest standing armies in the world against a small country that did not have adequate defenses. He was captured by the Germans, the Nazis, put in a prisoner of war camp, managed to escape, served in the Polish army for 6 years under British command, saw action in Palestine, in North Africa against Rommel, the Panzer division manager, and then served at the famous Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy. At the end of the war, he was convinced that the war was fought to save Eastern Europe, especially Poland, from dictatorship. As it turns out, and this is no derogatory remarks against the Allies, but if you remember history, it was at Yalta that Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed to carve up Eastern Europe and give that as a war prize to Russia, the Soviet Union. And as it turns out, that would be a worse fate for my parents to return to than living under Nazi occupation. The plan at the end of World War II was to return all peoples to their country of origin, so my parents were destined to go back to communist Russia because the Russians were given occupation of Poland at the time. The intent, the philosophical intent, was to allow each country to decide on their form of government at the time. And where you're dominated by the Russians, certain candidates for public office managed to disappear. Their opposition to the existing occupation was not highly recognized. It was a situation where it was almost guaranteed to go to communism. So my parents both managed to escape mainland Europe, managed to get to England, and managed to get a sponsor here in this country and came to this country legally. I am an American of Polish descent. I am not a hyphenated American, and I'm very proud of it. As a result of just my parents being able to escape from Poland, from Europe, and a very small portion of the families coming over, at this point, with the exception of my brothers and sisters and their immediate family, I have exactly one living relative here in the United States from the country of origin, close relatives, with not counting fifth and eighth cousins. So I stand very much in support of this, and if you don't believe this is a real thing, come talk to me. I have some real horror stories to tell you about my relatives. So thank you.
Thank you, good gentleman. Is there further debate? Gentleman from 16.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to briefly debate in support of the bill or the resolution. Very quickly, I think we can all agree that we don't want Russians meddling in our elections, and we can all agree that we don't want dictators running our country.
Is there further debate? Hearing none, then the debate is closed. The question before us is, shall Senate Concurrent Resolution number 119 pass the House? Without objection, there will be a voice vote. Hearing no objection, all in favor of the passage of SCR 119 say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and the resolution has passed the House and will be returned to the Senate.